am the Associate State Director of Outreach and Advocacy with AARP Texas, and I am going to tell you a little bit about AARP before we get in here. So a lot of people know about us, but it's pretty much a prerequisite when we're giving any kind of presentation. So some of this, a lot of you guys are going to be familiar with. We're talking about legislative process here today, so a lot of you are already engaged in that. So some of it's going to be a little bit of a review, and some of it's going to be some tidbits that we're going into that you might not know about. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and jump into kind of our overview. So talking about AARP and then AARP Texas. So we have a national office and then we have state offices. Our state offices operate a little bit differently based on what state you're in and how you're doing kind of policy and advocacy work. And the majority of our state offices are either doing local community engagement and or state and federal advocacy, which means we're talking to representatives, we're talking to congresspeople about the issues that impact the 50 plus community, which is pretty broad and pretty big. We have a big kind of infrastructure that talks about the power of older adults, and it's something that we like to talk a lot about here in Texas as the population is growing. And then I'll get into a little bit of the legislative process, interim committees, which you guys might have noticed. We've gotten a couple issue items that are out, and the Lieutenant Governor put out a couple yesterday, one of which would be of interest to this group. So we'll go over that. And then we'll talk about legislative priorities for the 89th session. Talking about priorities is going to be flexible, so we'll get into that as well. Does anybody have any other kind of things that they were hoping to see come out of this? Then my email address will be at the end, and we can open it up for some talking time and discussion. So let's jump in really quickly to AARP. So our founder, you can see here, is Dr. Ethel Percy Endress, and she started this organization basically after seeing the inhumane quality of life for a former teacher that was living in a chicken coop, which is kind of a very, very intense story. But that's how AARP got started, and a lot of people don't know that. It's a nonprofit and nonpartisan, despite what some might say, organizations dedicated to empowering how people choose to live as they age. And it is a 50 plus organization. So we are no longer the association, the American Association of Retired Persons. We are just AARP because a lot of our membership is still working when we talk about the 50 plus. And that ends up being an issue that we talk about a lot, which is workforce and making sure that there's equality and no kind of age discrimination. And there's opportunities for older adults in the workforce. So that's a big reason for our name change. We get that question a lot about why is it just AARP? And then we do a lot around health security, financial stability. Many of you might be familiar with what we call our Fraud Watch Network, which is a dedicated national source to reporting and tracking fraud across the nation and in your local communities. And we have a lot of volunteers that do work under that. And just general personal fulfillment, which is pretty broad and can change from state to state. So this is kind of our true or false sheet that I wanted to make sure everybody knew about. We do not endorse candidates. We do endorse issues, though. Right now at a federal level, we're talking a lot about Social Security and trying to keep that solvent. At a statewide level, we have a lot of priorities that I'll tell you a little bit about here in a minute. We never contribute money to candidates. We often work with coalitions, and I'm hoping that each one of you remembers us and feels free to contact me post this presentation so we can talk about legislative priorities or what's happening in your community that you feel AARP Texas needs to be aware of and connected to. We cannot distribute candidate material. Our volunteers do not do that. We can encourage people to vote, but we do not encourage any candidate endorsement. We can give a gift to legislators. It's very small, the amount we can give. I think it's like under $50. So we might be able to buy a Jimmy John's lunch for the office, but we are not those types of organizations. We are a membership organization. Candidates cannot use our trademark, and we do not support activities for or against candidates. So right now we're in a blackout period, so have to be pretty careful about when we're talking about senators and things like that later on in the presentation. Blackout period just means that I don't want it to seem like we are endorsing anybody that's currently running. So we will not talk highly about them or their the other candidate that's in the race. So if it seems a little wonky during that time, it's probably because we're during that we're in that blackout period where we just can't talk about those things. So that being said, AARP Texas has about 2.5 million members in Texas, and those members equal our volunteers. These volunteers do everything at the local level and the state level to help us out and to help our membership. So that's everything from tabling about fraud and scams at a baseball game, at a local football game, you name it, to on the bigger side of things, going to the Capitol and telling different representatives or their representative what issues are impacting them and what their thoughts and ideas are on legislation that could potentially pass. We have an office in Austin that does local engagement. And then, like myself, we have our state and federal team. And we office out of Austin, but we'll often travel to different districts in the state. And we'll also travel to Washington on occasion for federal issues. For the most part, I focus on state issues and not federal issues. And I have a couple other colleagues that do the same. We have offices in Dallas, Houston, El Paso, and San Antonio. And our policy is determined by national policy and our statewide members. So we like to keep that in mind that we do have a policy book. It does limit us in some ways, but it's pretty open-ended on what we can and cannot work on. And then we let our members and volunteers help direct us to what issues we're going to work on. And elder abuse and finance and scams and fraud are a huge part of our dossier and a huge thing that we hear about from our members on a regular basis. So want to know that the power of adults, I'm going to skip through this slide pretty quickly, is that we have the 65 plus population is one of the like largest growing populations in the state. That's probably not going to be new to anybody here at this table, but we need to be doing our job to educate leaders and those decision makers in the state that they need to be preparing for this population. And how we're doing that is helping to empower our members to go do that, to talk and to say the things that are impacting them, because this is going to be a growing population. And we want to continue to live with dignity and joy and life. And legislation actually impacts that. So we're giving them a voice at the Capitol. And we're hoping that we can do a little bit more education around the needs and opinions of older adults in the state of Texas. So that goes into a lot of different issue areas, but I just want to make sure that the group here knows that this is the fastest growing segment, and that's another important reason why this coalition exists. So I'll jump into it. I know I'm moving pretty quickly. State priorities of AARP Texas. So you can see that we touch on a lot of issue areas on this slide. There are about, I think, 5 of us total. My issue areas that I focus on fall under the long-term care side, the elder justice and abuse side, and healthcare. A little bit of kinship care and guardianship. So that's a lot. And while we can dig in depth to our policy issues, we rely on partners and coalitions like this to help guide what we're going to talk about and kind of our own legislative priorities. And we touch on all of these other items along with our federal issues of caregiving, which honestly overlaps with most of these issues that you're seeing on the slide. There have been a few different bills and ways that we participate in each of these issues. So we don't just participate during legislative session. We participate at PUC hearings. We participate at interim committees and rulemaking at agencies. So we're continually a voice throughout the entire process. When we're talking about bill implementation, or if we're talking about a change in a rule that could be impactful to a specific community. So just to give you a highlight, that's most of our issues fall into this. So legislative session, which is really what we're kind of here to talk about. A lot of you are engaged in the legislative process and probably know this already, but wanted to delve in a little bit into what legislative session looks like in the state of Texas. So it is biannual. It happens every 2 years. Now, legislative session in other states could be year-round, or it could be focused where they have special sessions that just talk about particular issues or focus on the budget or things like that. In the state of Texas, we're going to talk about everything that needs to happen, and we're going to do it in 140 days, which is crazy and also incredible all at the same time. And right now, we are currently, I would say, in the prep for session part of this diagram here. However, with the interim charges coming out from different committees or from the lieutenant governor and the governor's office, we're kind of in between. So we're a little behind based on where we've been with other legislative sessions. And so this whole cycle, AARP is engaged in the full cycle the whole time. And I think of note that legislative session has different committees, and that's where a lot of the work gets done. And I don't know everybody's full kind of scope of legislative session, but the 140 days is pretty quick. And I want to give you an idea of how many bills get filed and what that looks like. Last session, 8,000 bills, over 8,000 bills were filed. That is an incredible amount of bills. That has doubled from previous sessions. I think the most was close to 5,000, but nowhere near it. And so last session, we saw about 8,000 filed and only 1,200 or so were signed and put into law. So 140 days to talk about the issues that this coalition cares about or that your organization cares about is pretty short. And a lot of those bills don't even make it to a committee. And so committees are really where the beef and the work happens. So we'll get something filed, and then you'll want to see that bill move to a specific committee. It'll get signed to committee, and then it'll be up to the committee chair and members of that committee to actually read and hear the bill and consider it to move forward as legislation. So it'll either start in the House or it'll start in the Senate, depending on who filed the bill. The only thing that the legislature has to get done by the end of session is pass the budget. So all these other bills can go by the wayside, but the number one thing that the legislature has to do is the budget. So moving on, and I know it gets a little more wonky than that, but we're just doing a big overview, and you can ask any questions you want to, and I can hopefully answer them. So what happens when we're not in session? So we finished session, we've got the bills, and we're working on implementing them, which is where a lot of people here and organizations are relied upon, is to come help figure out how to implement these bills and to give input into kind of the bill's trajectory, how it's being implemented. If it hasn't, there have been a lot of cases where agencies have sat on legislation and we haven't seen movement on programs that we were expecting to come out of that agency. And so it's a lot of the advocates and groups that like this that are at the table that help move past legislation. The other part of this is rulemaking, and you can get engaged in different agencies to talk about the different rules at the agency that need to be implemented. A larger item are these interim charges. So the governor and the lieutenant governor will set out an interim charge for the time in between session and the next session to either study or get expert input on, or to get advocacy and testimony. Why interim charges are such a big deal, why I'm talking about them now, is because these interim charges really set the tone for next legislative session. So they'll tell you what the priorities are in advance. And it's a great opportunity for us to engage and start talking to legislators so they get to know you, they get to know your face, and they know you as a go-to person on this issue area. Of note for this group in particular, the Texas Senate Criminal Justice Committee. So these are lists of few of the committees that have interim charges this session. And it is limited to what AARP is watching. There are other committees that are happening right now as well, but these are some of the larger ones for our membership. So the Criminal Justice Committee for this group has a charge, and then the Texas House Business and Industry has a charge. Now that doesn't always compute. So when you start talking about, I'm talking about elder abuse, I'm talking about fraud, and I think it would be under maybe state affairs, or I don't understand why business and industry. We never know sometimes where these bills will end up. You can assume for the most part that a health and human service or healthcare bill is going to go into HHS committee or the health and human service committee, but you never know. So you have to pay close attention to where these bills are going. So of interest to this coalition is the interim charge on the Criminal Justice Committee on the Senate. This literally came out yesterday, so it's a good time to engage. For us, it's looking at the financial criminal activity trends in Texas, fiscal impact on consumers and businesses. The biggest thing for us at AARP that we're looking at is this Financial Crimes Intelligence Center. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this center, but this center particularly has funding and FTEs or full-time employees that are dedicated to doing investigations into elder financial fraud. Now, this group was primarily funded by the federal government and lost funding, or the funding ended, per se, it was a grant, towards the end of last session. AARP was one of the few advocates at the table telling the legislature that they needed to fund and make sure that this group was fully staffed. So we're pretty excited because we think they do wonderful things, but we want to make sure that they stay around and that they stay fully funded and that they have all of the things that they need to actually make these recommendations and make these connections and help people to prosecute those who are doing financial crimes, especially against older adults in the state of Texas. So it's things like this that we have to look out for. So we plan to come give testimony or provide testimony. Different ways to engage during the interim are to go visit with the Senate committee members or the House committee members about an interim charge and tell them why it's important that they're looking into this. Let them know that you could be an expert testimony or go give public testimony, or generally just get your face in front of them to say this is of importance to my community or what I'm working on. So specifically for this group, though it's a very small staffed sector under DFPS, and we want to make sure that it stays in place. So we're hoping that this committee is looking at all the wonderful things that they're doing and would consider continuing to fund them next session. But that's one interim charge of interest. The second one that came out right when the beginning of the interim charges came out was one in the House on business and industry. And this is protection against fraudulent deeds. And I do believe the Dallas County DA's office and a few of those in Dallas and Fort Worth have been talking about this, and it's become a real issue in those counties. So it's wonderful that they brought it up here as a point of interest, and it seems like they're going to be doing their research, and we're hoping that some other cities and counties come out to talk about what's happening in their areas. But this will be a priority for AARP going forward. So just of note. And so we are getting in front of the committee members, and we're actually providing testimony next week on this and a few other items that we're concerned about, because a lot of the deed behavior is happening to older adults. Phew. So last session, I will not get into all of the bills that passed. AARP, as I stated, has a limited amount of staff. So sometimes we will miss something that's critical and crucial, which is why it's so important. And I'm so thankful to Dana to have this platform and opportunity to connect with you, because we want to hear from you. We want to hear from what's happening in your communities, what you're seeing at the state level, and if you have any ideas for legislation. And so, yes, so Elva has a few things. I think Dallas County's issue with deed fraud is more around the clerk and what's happening there, and kind of the limitations to the clerk in that office. But the DA's office can probably go into a lot more detail. And we have a different policy expert that's talking a little bit about housing. And so deed fraud will fall under that. And we also talk about predatory practices as well. So sorry, I saw somebody talking in the chat and wanted to address it. So last session, a few bills did pass that we were pretty excited about and hopeful about. One that I do not have listed here is a requirement for training under DFPS staff. I think it was filed by Senator Blanco and Representative Candy Noble, to do more extensive training and training to completion for staff who are working on child welfare cases and also elder abuse cases. And that was a fantastic bill that passed, and not a lot of things crossed the finish line. So getting it through a committee or even through 2 committees is pretty incredible. And we like to tell anybody that does come to the Capitol and advocate that they need to keep that in mind, because sometimes it can be a little disheartening, but sometimes these bills take a couple years or a couple sessions to get through. So one that we had worked on previously that didn't go through, that did go through last session, was SB 2105. And this was a small bill that were.
Quick question for you.
Yep.
Oh, is there a question?
Doing a call campaign for people that have not certified yet for this year.
Yeah.
I was just asking.
Okay.
I muted them.
Oh, sorry. I was like, I don't know. So this particular bill required that data brokers needed to register with the state. So it seems kind of like a small bill, but it's a good step into kind of requiring some transparency, knowing who's at the table, and giving us a little more protection and control when we start talking about using our data, and potentially using our data for financial abuse. So a lot of things are going to come up around artificial intelligence and the use of data and online collection. And so this was a big step into providing some sort of oversight and regulation for these data brokers. So seems small, but could have a big impact and could lead to potential more insight into how do we regulate, how do we make sure that these are good actors that are at the table. We also have, because we focused a lot on data privacy, HB4, which was a more comprehensive data bill that was a big package that provides Texans with the right to know access, correct, and delete their personal data that has been covered and held by businesses, as well as to opt out of the collection and sale of their personal data if they somehow had opted in. which is a big step. We have all sorts of groups now that are focused on elder and older Texans data and getting that information, especially online, and how they opt out, if they opt in, was key because it's in the fine print. And we've seen this from anybody working in long-term care. We've seen this on websites. I don't want to call any websites out, but the first ones that you Google are currently in lawsuits because they are taking your data and selling it. And a lot of this can get into the wrong hands and can lead to financial abuse and other kind of areas where your identity is stolen, or your loved one's identity is stolen. And so this was a good step in the right direction. And another one that I put here at the bottom, and you guys might have a lot more that you're seeing, was that funding that I talked about earlier for that special investigative unit under the FCIC that focuses on elder financial abuse and fraud, and really being able to delve in and do those investigations. So things like this, I would highlight on the right side of this are a lot of our members and them coming to the Capitol and speaking on different issues and just visiting with different offices. So we have a few members that would like to focus on their issue area, which maybe that's healthcare. We had a few people that came out to advocate for no tax on adult diapers, for example. And then we had a few people that came out to advocate on the specific funding for the FCIC, to talk about how they personally had been frauded and had most of their life savings taken. So this was pretty impactful. And we think that by these individuals coming and sharing their story, which is a very hard story to share, that it moved people to fund this small little portion on the budget. So let me see. Next session, which is kind of what we're all thinking about here. Well, it is going to be a little crazy and a little different. It is every year. So to give you a heads up, there's a lot of political commotion between the House and the Senate. And so sometimes your bill doesn't get across the line because of personality differences, or because there's a big priority and certain people didn't support that priority. And so that means some of our bills get caught up in the minutia and the back and forth. And so we have to be cautious and we have to be careful, and we have to think about who really is the best person to file a bill, who are the relationships going into this, and who really knows and cares about your issue. So sometimes it's not going to be your personal representative. However, your personal representative is one of the best people to start educating and talking to about the issue that you care about, especially when we're talking about elder abuse and fraud. We have found that a lot of legislators care and do not want anything to happen in this area. They want to assure that there are protections and that our seniors are kept safe from all sorts of fraud and abuse, but they don't know that it's an issue, or they don't know that it's an issue to their constituents. So it's really important that we speak up. So some of these potential topics, and you guys are going to hear more, the Dallas DA's office, Houston DA's office, are some great offices that come, and we have a few rural Texas legislators that are really concerned about like door-to-door sales and contractor fraud. All of these things all of these industries are really targeting older adults. And as everybody here, based on previous presentations, have seen, yes, younger Americans are getting frauded more frequently, but older adults are losing more money and more of their stability due to fraud, scams. And then we're talking about other kind of items around abuse, and that's a whole other bucket. And there's a lot of safety items that we can address there. For the purposes of this slide here, this is not all that AARP will be working on. This is just around focusing on fraud and consumer protections. Often AARP is the only consumer protection group at the table. So we encourage other people to come and speak out. And we encourage you to tell us what's going on, because we rely a lot on gathering Attorney General data, talking to DOJ, DA offices, and really learning from other organizations that are doing the work on the ground. So, for instance, deed fraud. We didn't know a whole lot about it until we talked to the Dallas DA's office, and they gave us a good earful, and we are engaged. We're so engaged that we talked to our national office, and now our national office is making this a priority as well, because they're seeing it across the country. Door-to-door sales. Last session, there was a bill that would rescind the 3-day door-to-door sale rule. The door-to-door sale rule means that a consumer has the option to opt out after 3 days after signing a contract and figuring this out. Now, a lot of door-to-door sales are going to be kind of larger sales. We're talking about security systems, windows, solar panels. And this would allow, if you weren't sure what you were signing or you were confused and you signed something, this would allow them to be locked in. No 3 days, no consideration, no backtracking. And that's a huge issue when we're talking about understanding and what's going on. There are a lot of like door-to-door cell phone sales targeting at older Texans. And there are some issues around that and making sure that the contracts are there. But for the most part, it's one of these larger kind of door-to-door home improvement kind of situations that we're seeing. So we did a lot to protect and not get that bill across. So there are bills that you're going to see that are filed that are bad, that might be from some actors that you're like, that is going to be horrible for consumers. That's going to be horrible for older Texans, or they're not considering this population when they put this in place and the complications. And so those are other things that we want to be on the lookout for and be able to tell you guys about as far as what's happening. So legislative session starts January 14th and runs to June 2nd. And so those are some important dates to keep in mind around what's coming up. Now, saying that, bills are getting drafted and filed right now. Fall is the time where bills get drafted and they move pretty quickly. We are seeing more and more bills filed every year, and this does slow down the process. So it's important to get in front of legislators now if you have a potential issue. Keep in mind that sometimes it's easier to get something tacked on to a bill that already exists. A little nugget from somebody that's worked over there a bit, it's a bit easier to do this in the Senate than the House. The House has a lot of members, there's a lot of commotion, a lot of back and forth. And right now, the Speaker of the House, who has a lot of power over deciding committees, is up in the air. And so we're wondering who's going to get that position and what it's going to look like in the House and how committees are going to be structured. So a big piece of this too, going back to the legislature, is, oh, well, I know, Representative Frank is the chair of Health and Human Services, for example. Doesn't mean that Representative Frank is going to be the chair of Health and Human Services again. While he has held that for a few sessions, we never know what it's going to look like when the Speaker of the House or the Speaker of the Senate is decided. That being, or not Speaker of Senate, Speaker of the House. So that being said, there's a little bit of confusion and pause based on all of this on who do we co-sponsor or co-author for our bill, because that often means a stronger bill. You'll notice too that bills sometimes get filed separately as two separate bills, but they're identical bills. These are just vehicles to try to get the conversation started and to get the bill at least heard by one committee. So you'll often see a senator and a House member working side by side to move something if it's of critical importance. Another note to all of that is there is some hesitation right now based on this House discussion on who will be good partners or co-authors to file. So if you are personally working on something, that is a good thing to think of, and to do your research and see who really has cared or filed similar bills or has engaged in kind of your issue area. So back to legislative session, but other potential topics that AARP will be working on. And again, this is just in our fraud and consumer protections section. I'm not talking about our abuse or guardianship. We have a lot. And we also wait to see what else will be filed and how we can assist and help on to that. So we will have a few priorities, and then we'll be working with other organizations. And I'm very excited to have connected with a couple of you from this group to work with you, and looking forward to session. I want to delve in just a couple more of these and what we're thinking and the direction. And I always put potential topics because we don't know if the bill filed will get dropped or tacked onto something else, or if the language will change. And I think that's the key thing, is your language could change, and you could be supporting a bill, and then by the end of the language change, you could say, this is not a bill that I want any part of anymore. And so that's pretty problematic. But it happens. So sometimes that's just the way the cookie crumbles. You'll be at a stakeholder meeting, you'll be at the table, and then this bill will have changed so far from what you thought it would do that you can no longer support it. And then you, in fact, have to oppose it, or you have to be on it. On means, hey, it's headed in the right direction. I just can't support it. We need to have more conversations. I need to provide more information. But it doesn't mean that you are against it. And so a lot of times bills where everybody's on tend to not move. So word to the wise there. One of the other issues that we've been seeing that we want to bring up this next legislative session are solar panel cells. And this comes to the door to door. We're seeing a lot of older adults lose a ton of money. We're talking $20,000 to $30,000 on solar panels. This is a complicated issue because a lot of these individuals are coming to your door, and the sales individuals are getting older adults to sign on and thinking that they're going to save a lot of money. And then there's a third-party lender involved, and some of them are going farther enough to create an email address for that third-party lender for these older adults that they don't know about and agree to all these things. So the third-party lender actually has nothing to do with the installation and bringing out solar panels, but the third-party lender is who these individuals are on the line for paying. So they'll start making payments immediately with crazy interest rates, and then they will never receive the solar panels, or they won't be installed, or they won't work at all. And so there's a number of issues across the board. So solar panel sales are one issue area that we are really concerned about, because a lot of people are losing money, and they're losing their grandkids' college savings. We've had a lot of information thrown at us around this, and we're seeing that it's happening at a national level as well. So we're working with our national office on this. There should be some legislation filed this session, and we'll keep you abreast of what that looks like. And if you're seeing anybody that's experiencing this, we'd love to hear from them. But the AG's office is also taking in a lot of complaints around these door-to-door solar panel cells. Cryptocurrency kiosks and mining, as most of you know, based on previous presentations to this group, cryptocurrency has become a new way for scammers to get individuals' money. And so they create this big sense of urgency. Something's going to happen. There's a government agency that's contacted you that says you need to do this right now, or you're going to be in debt. The new jury duty scammers are out there saying, oh my gosh, you missed jury duty. You need to pay all this money, or you need to get here. All of these venues are also using cryptocurrency as a means to get those funds. So cryptocurrency kiosks have popped up as an easy way for scammers to get individual in the door and give them the funds through the kiosk. And I say kiosk, but you guys might have heard it as a cryptocurrency ATM. You might have seen these in your local HEBs and other grocery stores and gas stations around the state. And we really want to get some regulation on these. Cryptocurrency is really easy to download an app and engage with. So a lot of these kiosks are being used specifically by scammers. And so I think California tried to outlaw them completely. We'll be looking at kind of other options, and so we're gonna see. But if you see this as an issue, and we did hear this as a big issue at the APS conference, we'll be looking at that. Bank withdrawals limits, we'll be looking at senior justice assessment centers. There's one in Houston, and I think San Antonio is trying to get one of these. This is essentially close to y'all's task force, but it's a requirement of counties that have more than 1 million individuals to create these kind of multi I can't think of the word, but basically kind of like a task force that already exists between law enforcement and having the DOJ's office there, having a lot of connections to actually prosecute, investigate, and work together. That's a basics. And then we'll be looking into AI and what comes out of that, because that's going to be very impactful when we're talking about identity theft and impersonation fraud, and just seeing what the state does and how they're headed during session and what their ideas around AAR are. So I know that was a mouthful. I was trying to go pretty quickly there at the end because I have taken up a lot of time. So that being said, if you want to look up committee hearings or engage in any of those interim hearings, I would say Texas Legislature Online. You can Google that and find it. There's different ways that we can maneuver through this, but Texas Legislature Online, you can look up previous bills, and you can look up the committee hearings and what time they are and how you can submit testimony. Thank you all. And here is my email address. And thank you so much for your time. I apologize for going a little over.
Oh, such great information. Thank you so much, Andrea. Does anyone have any questions? I'm just sure.
So thank you for the wonderful information and the work that you do, Andrea, and the team. I am curious, you talked about state and federal. Do you ever propose initiatives for counties or cities? In particular, some of the counties, I'm in Tarrant County, and some of the smaller cities have where door-to-door salespeople have to register. I can't say that I believe it's helpful,
Effective.
but right, but it's something. So do you ever go under the state level?
Yes, under the state level. So our local offices, it depends on our membership and kind of what they bring to them. A lot of times what you'll hear from our local offices, what they're engaged in and what our members are up to is education around fraud. So they want to hear if they need to go be talking to somebody, but also they'll engage in, I think, housing issues. So they'll be up there talking to the committee. I mean, we're often talking about ADUs, which is not a thing that this group needs to talk about, but so it really depends on our membership in that area, and if they're poised and ready to talk effectively about it. So every one of our offices is really engaged in fraud and scams. And so they're really trying to engage more at a local advocacy level. So yes, it is something that they would want to jump in on and be able to be a voice for.
Thank you.
Great. And Elva has a question. Elva.
Yes, thank you. I was disappointed when AARP stopped funding your Tarrant County or Fort Worth representative. You used to have one in Dallas and one in Tarrant, and then the Tarrant County one went away. And I wish we had better representation or more representation here. But aside from that, I guess you just said it's based on membership and blah, blah about where you spend your money. But payday lenders has been a hot topic from time to time. And
Big
for a
topic.
while, I worked with Chris Turner, who's my state representative, and I was on his coalition panel to outlaw or get rid of payday lenders. And for a while, we worked with the city of Arlington, and we got rid of them, and they all moved to Dalworthington Garden or Pantego. But now I see that they're back in full force. Every corner and every other ad on television is about these payday lenders who exploit people. And I just wondered if that's not on the list to look at.
Oh, that is a huge issue for us. And so I said consumer protections. There's two of us that kind of work on that area. And my colleague, Stephanie Mace, she actually used to work for Dallas County United Way, if her name sounds familiar, doing all of the predatory lending work. And so that will also be a big cause for her this next session. She's a part of the Fair Lending Alliance group, and that is one of the strongest groups at the Capitol advocating against these payday lenders and other kind of preemption, because there's a few bills that come out every session that could undo all of the payday lending based on preemption of another issue. So that's one thing that we have to constantly monitor. And it's similar to like group homes and issues that we're seeing with unregulated group homes, them moving right outside the county or right outside the line. And so they're also working on some broader legislation to tackle the fact that these groups are just moving a little bit out of the way and still taking advantages of the constituents in the city and the surrounding areas. So the Fair Lending Alliance group will be active in that, and AARP will continue to be advocating for, I wish we could say the abolishment of these institutions, but the regulation of these bad actors.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrea. We appreciate your expertise. I feel like I was in class, but I learned a lot. So that's very helpful, because I know I learned probably all of that way back when, but just kind of faded out over the years. So thank you. Look forward to working with you on some